Howdy, friends. I'm excited to talk to you guys about this book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. Just finished this book last week, and this has had a huge impact on me. Alan Kreider is the author, and the subtitle is The Improbable Rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. His thesis is that there was something very unique about the first 2 to 3 centuries of the early church that has to do with their obsession around patience, and that this has been almost entirely lost by the modern church. It actually transitioned, as he describes it, around the 3rd, 4th century. So I'll talk about that, but I want to give you guys the top 10 things I learned from this. This book has really impacted me. It could be in the top 3 books in the last 10 years in terms of the level of impact. So I want to count down the top 10 things I learned from this. So if you're interested, it's a pretty dense book, very scholarly. It's very easy to read, but certainly a lot of content, but it was definitely worth every page. It kept me hooked all the way through. So I want to give you guys these top 10 things, and I encourage you guys to read this. But if you want to kind of get the Cliff Notes version or the things that are really stirring up inside of me because of reading this book, I want to walk through those things with you guys right now. So number 10 is that evangelism takes place through patience. He points out that the early church wrote 3 extensive treatises on patience, but not a single one on evangelism. So he walks through these 3 different treatises that were written by the early church and how they were completely obsessed with living this lifestyle of patience. And it's through patience that their evangelism was done. And it was really remarkable to think about the way they lived was actually what caused people to become very intrigued. As he says, evangelism comes for people being intrigued by our way of life. Origen saw all the world as a theater watching to see how Christians respond to persecution. So part of what they were doing in terms of evangelism is they would undergo these various persecutions, and because there was so much training on how to patiently endure through all kinds of different adversarial circumstances, people would see this resilience, this resilient patience. And this patience was just being fermented constantly by the leaders of the church amongst all of the people that were coming into the kingdom at the time. And it was really an encounter with that patient ferment that caused people to want to become believers. He says, quote, "The Christian focus was not on saving people or recruiting them. It was on living faithfully in the belief that when people's lives are habituated in the way of Jesus, others will want to join them." So a huge part of this is changing the habits of people from being the regular kind of impatient way that somebody would normally live, being offended and being reactive to these circumstances, to living out this lifestyle of trust and patience. And he quotes Wolfgang Reinbold, who describes church growth in this way: if the Christians raise their children as Christians, and then Christian men in the course of a generation can convince only one of his pagan neighbors, that will create explosive growth over 3 centuries. So a big part of what the author was describing is if you can train your own children, so you keep 100% of your kids or close to 100%, and then just see one person come to faith, then you're going to have exponential growth over the course of a number of centuries. And oftentimes when we focus on evangelism, lose our kids in the process, not attract people through our way of life, then this oftentimes leads to a shrinking church. So it's a really interesting thesis, and the connections he was making there were very unique and I thought were really helpful. Okay, number 9, their services, the church services, were secret. And your engagement with the Christian community would start with discipleship and then culminate in your baptism and then attendance and inclusion in the Christian community. So we have this inverted, right? People come to our worship services, and then over time, we're hoping that maybe through the course of, lots and lots of engagement with the worship service, we can convince them to go through discipleship. And they really inverted that process. To them, it was you would be discipled into a connection over a year or 2 or 3 years into baptism, and that baptism would be a baptism into the community, and then you start attending the regular church services. So he says, by the 2nd century, non-believers were barred from attending the Christians' secret Sunday services. The church only baptized those who lived their lives as Christ instructed. So there was a series of what he calls scrutinies, and during these scrutinies, as you were being discipled, they would look at your life and see whether or not it is exhibiting these signs of this patience that he refers to a lot. Are you living a lifestyle of nonviolence? Are you living a lifestyle like Christ? Are you not coercing people? Are you learning how to endure patiently any kind of adversarial situation? Quote, "Those who are found not living as Jesus taught should know they are not really Christians, even if his teachings are on their lips." This is from Justin Martyr, And part of what he was describing in the book is that the way that you talk, what you say you believe, to the early Christians was not really that important. What they really wanted to know is how you lived. So they would be teaching you beliefs, but they would want to see those beliefs translated in new habits, and those new habits were the things that they were really scrutinizing. Because during the scrutinies, they didn't ask what you thought or believed, but what you did. So for the poor example, like you could say, well, yeah, of course I want to serve the poor, but do you, right? And then if you went through these scrutinies, they determined you were a believer because of the quality of your life, then you'd be baptized. They baptized people 3 times, once in the name of the Father, then in the Son, and then the Holy Spirit. There, for the first time, they experienced the loving solidarity of their new family. They pray with all the people. They exchange the kiss of peace, and for the first time, they take part in the Eucharist, in which they receive milk and honey as well as bread and wine. They have entered the promised land and can sing, as Origen put it, a new song. And so there would be this moment where they would come into the church and they would go from going through this discipleship process, this catechesis, as he described it. And then as they graduated from that and went through these scrutinies, then they would enter into the church. And this was a cause for explosive celebration, milk and honey, like you're now in the promised land. So yeah, quite a different way of entering the church. So that's number 9. Number 8 that I learned was God's method, according to the early church, was patience. Origen summarized the Old Testament as God's mission with Israel was constantly unhurried but unstoppable. And so you see how God allowed century upon century upon century to transpire in the Old Testament as he was discipling Israel, even though they were going through all kinds of seasons where they were struggling to overcome idolatry. And so this unhurried and unstoppable process that God was initiating with his people is the kind of process that God is taking the church through. I thought that was really interesting, and something that, if you think about, we're 2,000 years into this process, and it seems like we're struggling. But when you go to the Old Testament and look how God interacted with Israel, that's fairly consistent. God is not in any crazy hurry. He's trying to form a kind of people, and he's willing to take centuries and many generations to get there. Origen also says, never exact an eye for an eye, but respond using silence, patience, and blessing. Tribulation produces patience. This is also Origen. So they saw God's method of discipling you was every kind of situation that you were going through. All of these tribulations were a part of the design. They were features, not a bug. They caused you to learn the process of patience and allow the church and the people discipling you to see how you were going to respond and to really determine whether or not you actually believed. And so these situations were really key for the early church, in this case Origen, the way he was leading his church to try to make sure that people were actually believing and following the way of Christ. Okay, that's number 8. Number 7, full participation was the way that the church gathered. So he talks a lot about the way that the first 2 to 3 centuries of the church gathered. He says their gatherings each could bring a scripture passage, a testimony, or a song. Members uttered prophecies, spoke of visions to empower all members and give them a sense of their worth that expressed itself in courageous living and bold testimony. So he describes the house church. He says house churches continued to dominate for a full century after Constantine. He describes how the people that were a little bit more well off would be the ones who would often host these house church gatherings. They considered their Saturday evening service as festival days, according to Tertullian. Mornings were for catechesis, evenings were for meals. And so they would have time in the morning where they would, on a Sunday morning, focus on discipling the people that were coming into the kingdom, but often the actual church would gather in the evening. He said usually it was a Saturday evening because that was their Sunday, right? Because they began the day in the evening. During the first half of the 3rd century, the church has moved from an evening meal society to more of a morning worship assembly. So it was really about 3 centuries into the progression of the church where you started to see this change from the evening meal to the morning. He says the post-meal teaching was often focused around people's questions, a lot of interaction. So you would have a meal, a teaching, and part of that teaching would involve interaction. As things became increasingly liturgical, the words spoken by the clergy increased, the rest of the congregation, their interaction decreased. So he really says you can sort of chart a transition that happened where the clergy became more and more dominant in the course of the worship gathering or the service, the church service, the post-meal gathering, and that as that happened, the congregation became more passive. He said that Origen, they talked about the length of his sermons, and they They usually lasted between 6 and 15 minutes because this was just a part of the many things that were being done to build up the body. And so you would not give all the time to the bishop to do a lengthy sermon because that kind of puts a damper on the rest of the people that were participating. So from Tertullian, it says the banqueters washed their hands, lights were lit, then each one takes part in a time of free worship, singing, speaking, drawing from their own hearts as well as possibly from scripture, testimonies, prophecies, and then it would end with prayer and the kiss of peace. The kiss was not normal, it was something that families shared, and so the church initiated this idea of the kiss of peace. You see this referred to at the end of many of the epistles where the apostles were instructing people to actually share this kiss, which was something that you would only do with somebody that you were in a very close relationship with. And so they actually practiced this as a part of the way that they were breaking down the barriers between people and really entering into a more family environment. All right, number 6, they believed the church would bring on the Messianic era of peace and an end to war. So one of the things that Kreider points out is that the most popular passage in the Old Testament for the early church was Micah 4. Also, it's quoted there in Isaiah 2. It's a very similar passage where it talks about the end of war, where in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of all the mountains. The peoples of the earth will stream to it. They'll turn their spears into pruning hooks and their swords into plowshares, and no one will practice war anymore. They saw this Messianic era of peace being something that is being ushered in by the church. He says it was, according to scholar Gerhard Lofkin, the prophetic passage most cited in the early church was Micah 4, Isaiah 2. They saw themselves as in the process of fulfilling this prophecy. So a big part of this conversation around patience was that they believed that the church had the power through its patience and through its example to end war between nations. And so we'll talk about how that ended. That idea started to get eroded in the church. But for hundreds of years, the first few hundred years, this was a major desire for the church, and they believed they could accomplish this kind of peacemaking through being nonviolent and through being patient. All right, number 5, everyone had to be in a right relationship for the service to go forward. So there was a real obsession with making sure that every person in the church, so again, imagine everybody had to go through this lengthy process to become a member of the church. So you didn't have just tons of like new people joining the church that nobody knew. Everybody knew each other well. Everybody had been discipled in immersive ways. They understood the gospel. They understood the way of Christ. So when there was a dispute that would break out between brothers and sisters within this church, everything would sort of stop until that got resolved. Okay. The Didache says that, for example, no eating the communal meal until you are reconciled with everyone present. So if everyone is not at peace with one another, the worship service, they believe their worship would be worthless. So God would not receive their worship if there were people that were not getting along. Without patience, Tertullian says the Holy Spirit will leave. Okay, so, the idea that, okay, what we're offering the world, and this kind of goes back to the Isaiah 2, Micah 4 idea, we're offering the world a way towards ultimate peace. Peace in our hearts, peace between God, peace between each other, peace between nations. And if that peace cannot be lived out in the context of our, small community, our house church, then what do we have to give the world? Nothing, right? So they were very adamant about this, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but this was a huge part of the life of the bishop, was to really bring about this kind of life of peace between the members of the congregation. All right, number 4, everyone was giving a sponsor, what we would think of today as a discipler. So it says, quote, "It is an absolute necessity that you who are haughty and powerful and rich should appoint for yourselves some man of God as a trainer or a pilot." This is Clement of Alexandria. The trainer or pilot would face the second scrutiny, where the sponsor gives account to the church's leader for the candidate's progress and habitus. So part of what happened is if you started becoming intrigued by this way of life, you would be giving a sponsor. One of the things that Clement is really emphasizing here is if you are used to being high status in the world, then you really are going to need help, because this is going to disrupt so much of your life that somebody needs to really guide you into having this very humble way of Christ about you. And so it's going to take months, years for you to learn the habits that are going to transform your heart and transform the way that you live and allow you to enter into the church in a positive way. So there were these series of scrutinies. I think there was 4 total, but the second scrutiny he pointed out was actually the person being scrutinized was not the person being discipled. It was the actual sponsor, Pilate, the discipler, who would be asked the questions. Is this person really exhibiting the way of Christ? Asking detailed questions about their way of life, understanding their occupation, their family, everything that's going on in their life would be scrutinized to see whether or not this transformation was actually taking place. And this would, of course, be particular to if you were this sort of high status person. This would become something that you would be deeply scrutinized to see if this change was actually occurring. Sponsors, it says, are very important, using an almost military discipline of changing human reflexes like a boot camp or a wrestling school. So they really wanted your impulses to be transformed, your human reflexes, so that when you were attacked, when you were being insulted, like something else would come out of you that was totally unique. And again, this was not something that they thought could just magically happen through believing the gospel, but they believed it had to be trained into you as well. So the belief was sort of the foundation for the transformation, but the actual training was required for the transformation to really work its way into your habits. Which brings us to number 3. Catechesis was designed to change your habits. The catechists knew that people are profoundly formed by the stories they tell. Many catechists made it a priority to present the Bible's narrative to replace the pagan stories as their primary fund of memory. So they were deeply discipled in the stories in Scripture, the stories in the Gospels, and these would really replace a lot of the pagan stories that were forming other habits. And so they saw how story-formed people were, and they really used that in a way to ensure that people going through catechesis were learning the kinds of stories that would transform their habits. In the catechesis, Christians become a peaceful people, soldiers of peace, in God's, quote, bloodless army, who wear the armor of peace. They gave rings with images of fish, sails, anchors, never swords, bows, because we cultivate peace. One of the things that was so clear in Kreider's writing is how peaceful they were and how unusual that was at this time in history. And so the idea that they are soldiers of peace, a peaceful people, a bloodless army, again, that was their evangelism method. People were like, well, what is going on with you? You just patiently endure being attacked? Like, that's crazy. And this is what caused people to take a second look at the Christians of their day to try to figure out, what was really motivating them to live this completely different kind of life. All right, number 2, I was really struck with how the bishops lived at this time. Of course, bishop, elder, presbyter, these are similar words, but you definitely had at these times specific leaders who were emerging that were really important for each of these congregations. Community leaders were bivocational and unpaid at first until the requirements grew beyond their voluntary capacity. So there was a time where a lot of the bishops were not being paid at all and were bivocational. The Didaskalia, this is another book that he goes into lots of detail about, like, understanding the way that they were living. Wants the bishop to make a scene of giving up his chair to an older person and demonstrate basically the decision not to be class conscious. So somebody walks into the church, the Didaskalia, it gives instruction to each person about what to do. So if this person is poor, you want to make sure that they get a place to sit. If this person is older than the bishop, then the bishop would stop the entire service basically to give up his seat to this elder person. And that this process of demonstrating what James talks about in James 2, the giving up of chairs, the flattening of status, was something that the bishop explicitly needed to participate in. It says leaders had 3 main responsibilities: relief for the poor, community life, and catechesis. And then if a dispute arose, a deacon would investigate, and then on a Tuesday, they would form a sort of court-like hearing to figure out how to resolve this dispute between believers that would be overseen by the bishop. Because peacefulness was such a massive priority, what you had with the bishops were they had to engage whenever there was a dispute between believers to really investigate enough to figure out, like, who is at fault and how to resolve this. Because again, they couldn't continue with their worship while brothers and sisters or sisters were at odds with each other. And I just found that really interesting. I'm still really processing what that would look like. So the 3 things, again, that the bishop would really engage in is relief for the poor, community life, which is ensuring that the quality of the life, the unity of the believers was preserved. And then they were constantly involved in catechesis, or what we call discipleship, really helping these people that were kind of members to the church go through the 1, 2, 3 year process of catechesis to fully imbibe the way of Jesus, so that when they join the church in that massive celebratory moment, went through baptism and received their first Eucharist, everyone was fully aware that they had been trained in the way of Christ and could represent the community in public. And so they would join this sort of secret weekly service. So, number one, the last thing I learned, and this is very sad, but necessary thing to learn, Kreider really points out that Constantine was the beginning of the end of this sort of theme of patience, and that Augustine was basically the nail in the coffin. He was the end. And so he's got 2 chapters at the very end, one about Constantine and the impact that Constantine had on the church. But man, does he not hold back on the impact that Augustine had and how that was really the end of the culture of patience. And he really goes into detail as to what Augustine wrote and how this happened. And I think he holds Augustine more accountable. One of the things I didn't realize, and that he really points out a lot in the book, is that Constantine was not baptized until, I think, just days before he died. And the reason was because the church was holding to this very high standard of how you need to live if you're a part of our community. Constantine could not really, as the emperor, living like a Roman emperor, executing people, like going through those kinds of processes, was so radically different than the way that the church lived. So even though he believed in Jesus, he really couldn't join the church. And so he was going through this process of overseeing councils and, weighing in on theology, all while not a member of the church, not being in any kind of submission to a particular congregation, not having gone through baptism until just before he died. So there was a bishop, Lactantius, who constantly was exhorting Constantine about how he could go through this transformation. It says, Lactantius exhorted him that religion must be defended not by killing, but by dying, not by violence, but by patience. Imagine how that would sound to a Roman emperor. You're going to defend the faith not by killing, but by dying. Wow, so difficult to imagine how that was going to get assimilated into a church, a state church, right? And so there was a lot of tension between the way the early church was functioning and Constantine really trying to integrate Christianity more into the emperor. Another thing he pointed out was Constantine, there were certain issues he weighed in on very heavily. He absolutely hated the Jewish calendar and the influence of sort of the Jewish elements of the faith. And so Kreider talks about that. It says, in order for those who have more worldly concerns to be accepted in the church, a 2-tier kind of lifestyle began to emerge where the clergy was held to a higher standard and the standard for the laity was lowered. At this time, clergy began to wear even distinct clothing. So one of the things that occurred because of Constantine is you had all these people that were a part of the government that were participating in things that in the past, if you were doing those things, you'd have to basically quit your job to join the church, or there'd be very strict restrictions on things that you could or couldn't do, even as a part of your occupation. And so this caused people to really have to pull back. Well, one of the weird things that started to occur is because so many of these more high status government officials, people in the military, things like that, wanted to join the church. How do you do this while still trying to hold on to the way of Christ? And so what began to emerge is this 2-tier system where the clergy was, held to a higher standard than the laity in order to allow people like Constantine to get closer to the church, people that were in official positions that historically would either have to resign their occupation or would have to be very restricted. And so in order for this to become more realistic, in their sense, to rule an empire, but still believe in the way of Jesus, we're going to hold the clergy responsible for living out this very pure lifestyle, but the laity, they will be given a lot more leeway to live in this secular world, right? And then Augustine formalized the distinction between the sacred and the secular, those dedicated to the church and those who keep the wheels of commerce and government turning. And so Augustine was sort of the apologist for this transformation. He says Augustine altered the church's approach to nonviolence and patience. He was in favor of using coercive power of the state in situations like his fight with the Pelagians of his day. And so at the very end of the book, Kreider says that this book travels from patient ferment to impatient force. And so that's kind of what it leaves you with, this question. And the question I would pose to you guys and what I've been really asking myself as I've been reading this book is, did we make a huge mistake when we decided to fuse church and state? And did we reinterpret the Gospels in light of how do we wield power like a secular government while still trying to hold to the way of Jesus. And when you really take a step back and look at the way that the early church thought about this, how they interpreted the words of Christ, how they lived the words of Christ, how that resulted in explosive evangelism, how it began to move us toward the Messianic era of peace, and how idealistic that sounded to people that were in ruling positions of power. And that just started to break down when we created this fusion that Augustine really cemented, which is he was really trying to figure out, how do you live as a government? How does the church and how does the city of God work with the city of man? How do these things kind of interact? And so he began his journey, as Kreider describes. Augustine kind of began in a place where he understood the role of patience and even wrote his own treatise on patience. But he began to really change and redefine what that meant as he was coaching and exhorting people in government, particularly the emperor. And so this assumption that church and state have to get together really changed the whole nature of the way that people thought about topics like patience that was so central. And now it's almost completely foreign to modern Christians to think that patience is the primary means through which we are distinct from the way that others live. So, wow, I can't recommend this book enough. I think it's so important that we understand the roots. And I believe that most people's traditions, when it comes to their church or their theology, it usually roots itself back into a certain century. It might root back to the Reformation, but for so many of us, there are a lot of things that started around the 3rd or 4th century with Constantine and Augustine that I think we need to question and push back into the 1st and 2nd centuries. And Kreider's book does a fantastic job of helping guide you through the process of really considering what a pre-Constantinian, pre-Augustinian church looked like.